Thank you very much, Tom, for that generous introduction. Isn't it terrible to think that I only got here by default? But I'm very happy to be here, and it's a great honour and a privilege, and thank you all for taking the time to come out. I know a lot of people are battling all sorts of illnesses and flus at the moment. Those two daughters that Tom mentioned were charging around at 1 o'clock this morning as well, so they do get that energy at frightening times sometimes as well. The title that Tom just mentioned is one that has been prompted by a number of things swirling around in my head over the last couple of months in particular. Perhaps having a bit of distance from Ireland has also enabled me to try and articulate it somewhat more forcefully and to translate those thoughts into some kind of coherent thesis, or at least an attempt at a thesis anyway. The concept of the just society is one that briefly and perhaps half-heartedly caught the political imagination in Ireland in the 1960s, by about the middle of the 1960s. And it's not just prompted by that sense in the 1960s that things could change, this presentation tonight. It's also prompted by a number of things that are perhaps more close, particularly what Ireland has been through in the last 20 years. The rise and fall of the Celtic Tiger economy. The party in Ireland is well and truly over. And some of the news that's coming through from Ireland at the moment is quite frightening in terms of the growing fears about the future of the economy, the recession and so on. Irish pensioners, interestingly, have taken to the streets in recent days because of a savagely inequitable budget that was introduced a couple of weeks ago by the current government, which in true Irish fashion targeted both the old pensioners and also the very young in terms of education cuts, and apparently there's more protests on the way. So in a sense you can see at this stage that that Celtic Tiger is well and truly dead. So in a sense I'm coming to this subject at a time when we have lived through a boom and are now bracing ourselves for the recession. It's going to be very interesting to see how that pans out. Thankfully, it's not the job of the historian to predict the future, so I don't have to dwell on that too much. But it does bring into focus a lot of the other themes that I want to address tonight. Another issue that's relevant, perhaps, is the sense that the post-Civil War generation are very much on the way out. Some of the most prominent of those post-Civil War politicians or post-Civil War generation of politicians have died in recent years, including, of course, Charles J. Haughey, one of the more controversial prime ministers of the 20th century, but also individuals who perhaps made an equally significant contribution, though in a quieter way. People like Patrick Hillery, the former president of Ireland, who died earlier this year as well. Another thing that has prompted these reflections tonight is that sense of the end of the era of Bertie Ahern. Bertie Ahern, who served as Taoiseach from 1997, or Prime Minister from 1997 up until this year. And he was a further illustration of the manner in which Fianna Fáil continued to dominate the political landscape. And they did dominate the political landscape for the duration of this particular period, 1967 to 2007. And I think all of these issues and all of these questions raise the themes of change and continuity, the degree of change in Irish politics, the degree of continuity in Irish politics as well. And I was interested in September 2007 to find an edition of McGill, which is Ireland's current affairs magazine. And it was celebrating 30 years on the go, with a few breaks along the way. And this was a magazine that had been established by Vincent Browne, one of the most provocative, interesting and contrary Irish journalists of his generation. At this stage, he was not editing McGill any longer, but McGill did decide to ask people who had been central to the McGill cause, or the McGill crusade in the 1970s and 1980s, to reflect on how Ireland had changed and how Irish society had changed over the last 30 years or so. And they were asked two particular questions. How different was Ireland in 2007 than it was in the early 1980s, and had it changed for the better? And the two individuals who were asked to contribute to this discussion were Colm Tóibín, the Irish novelist who had served as editor of McGill in the middle of the 1980s, and Jean Kerrigan, who was one of the most important investigative journalists associated with McGill magazine in the 1980s. He now writes for the Sunday Independent. If you look at the responses that they gave to that particular set of questions, you can see this divergent approach to the previous 30 years of Irish history. For example, Colm Tóibín, when he was responding to the first question as to how different Ireland was now than then, he said, "We are now rich and famous." When he was asked the second question as to whether Ireland was now better or worse, his response was, "Are you joking?" Jean Kerrigan, on the other hand, suggested that the big difference between 2007 and the early 1980s was the confidence that he saw in young, educated people, particularly those who did not have to make that decision to emigrate. But he also suggested that the same arrogance was there with regard to how the political system worked. There was an arrogance there that was very consistent with the 1980s in terms of what the political priorities were. And he said that in many respects, this is in response to the question of whether Ireland was better or worse, he said it's remarkably similar. And the people who are running the country are remarkably similar in spirit and in family. Now, I think a lot of people will be more sympathetic to Colm Tóibín's response than they will be to Jean Kerrigan's response to that particular question. It depends, of course, which Ireland you are looking at or which Ireland you are trying to locate. Of course, Ireland was more famous in 2007 than it was in the early 1980s. Ireland was a much more liberal society in 2007 than it was in the early 1980s, particularly when it came to the personal rights of individuals and the extent to which those rights could be vindicated by the courts and so on. Ireland was most obviously much more prosperous in 2007 than it was in the early 1980s. And of course, you have to give credit to Irish politicians for the role that they played in this. But you also have to be mindful, and this is where Jean Kerrigan's ideas are important, of the degree to which there was a remarkable conservatism there throughout that 30-year period. And it's one of the reasons why I'm interested in looking at the Irish political parties in the context of change and continuity and that degree of consistent conservatism when it came to that fundamental issue of whether or not they would seek to do things differently than the previous generation. It struck me that an awful lot of the change that occurred in Irish society was change that came about as a result of people working outside of the political process and outside of the main political parties. And that in itself raises an interesting theme about the degree of pressure that's been exerted from below when it comes to actually changing people's experiences and changing Irish society. Now, how will historians deal with these particular themes of change and continuity and of challenges? What areas will the historian need to highlight? Well, the first question they have to ask themselves is what source material is available to try and evaluate the 1960s, 1970s, and the 1980s, which is where the National Archives Act in Ireland becomes very important, because under that legislation from 1986, state papers, government papers, can be accessed by researchers after a 30-year period has lapsed. So in that sense, we do have a good idea of what was going on behind the scenes politically in Ireland in the 1960s and for much of the 1970s as well. I was interested in the extent to which you could locate authentic voices, authentic values, authentic visions within those papers, within political debate, within the political parties generally. And this was something perhaps that arose in my mind as a result of my study of Eamon de Valera as well. Many of you will be familiar with perhaps one of the most famous broadcasts of 20th century Ireland, which was Eamon de Valera's Ireland That We Dreamed Of speech on St. Patrick's Day in 1943, when he talked about the Ireland that his generation of politicians had dreamed of. And it's something that came to be widely derided because of its articulation of this idea of a Gaelic utopia, of the serene wisdom of old age, of the happy comely maidens, of the sturdy youths. And the idea was that this was something hopelessly out of date, hopelessly romanticized, and of course, perhaps rightly came to be criticized by that generation who had no choice but to emigrate during the 1950s in particular. But nonetheless, it's worth looking back on that articulation of visions in the context of what I want to talk about tonight, because you will often see that there is a lack, a very obvious lack, of the articulation of any kind of vision from politicians from the 1960s right up to the present day. And in that sense, I think we need to be careful about the extent to which we deride a previous generation for articulating visions, because at least they were trying to formulate their ideas into some kind of coherent philosophy or some kind of coherent strategy as to where they wanted to see Ireland go in the future. Now, in the context of the changes that were witnesses, we also need to be mindful of the positive things that were done. Education was recognized as being paramount in Ireland in the early 1960s. And this brings me back to Patrick Hillery, who I mentioned at the outset. I was very interested in the obituaries of Patrick Hillery when he died earlier this year, partly because he was a quiet man, partly because he was a well-liked and well-respected man, partly because he seemed to stand outside of an awful lot of the infighting that went on and the feuds that went on within Fianna Fáil from the early 1970s onwards in particular. And Brian Cowan, who's our current Taoiseach Prime Minister, made the point when he made the oration at the funeral of Patrick Hillery that Hillery had sculpted his political career in a very quiet way, but it was nonetheless effective for that. And I think that that is strikingly true. It also chimes with something that Tom Garvin, who was previously a Byrne scholar here a couple of years ago, something that he made much of in his book, Preventing the Future, Why Was Ireland So Poor for So Long, when he talked about Patrick Hillery as a quietly explosive Minister for Education in the early 1960s. The idea that Patrick Hillery had to overcome the vested interests in order to change the Irish approach to education, that you had to ensure greater access, that you had to identify second level and third level education as a priority, and getting people from second level into third level education as a priority. And Patrick Hillery's view of this was quite simple on one level. More education was needed in Ireland. More access to education was needed in Ireland. But whatever about that being a simple idea, trying to put it into practice was never going to be simple in a country, particularly where the education system was so tightly controlled. And confronting those vested interests, facing down the Catholic Church on many occasions, was something that Patrick Hillery had to do, and he did do. But he did it in a quiet way, but he did it in a nonetheless effective way, to echo those words of Brian Cowan as well. It's also important to mention Hillery in the context of him laying the groundwork for what became the Donogh O'Malley Revolution of 1966. Donogh O'Malley, one of Patrick Hillery's successors as Minister for Education, made a very famous announcement in 1966 that he was introducing free secondary education with effect from the beginning of the school year in 1967. He made a very powerful case for free education in Ireland at that stage. Every year, he said, some 17,500 Irish children were finishing their primary cert course and were not going on to further education. That meant, he said, that 1 in 3 Irish children were cut off from the cultural, social, and economic benefits that went with further education. And he finished by saying that that was a dark stain on the national conscience. Donogh O'Malley was absolutely right about that. But we do need to be careful not to see Donogh O'Malley in isolation. He was the third of 3 reforming education ministers, George Colley, Patrick Hillery, and himself. It's also important in the context of what it meant in practice, this implementation of free secondary education. Garret Fitzgerald, who went on to become leader of Fine Gael and was a very dominant political personality in Ireland in the 1980s, still makes the point up to recent times that if that had not been recognised, that a priority need to be attached to education, the Irish economic boom of the late 20th century would not have happened. They had to invest in education, and investing in education was something that led to a serious economic dividend by the end of the 20th century. What was also interesting and tragic, of course, about Donogh O'Malley was that his political career was ended very suddenly and very prematurely in the spring of 1968 when he dropped dead. Donogh O'Malley was an interesting character. He was a hard liver. He was somebody who had been put on the straight and narrow in order to get a cabinet position, but in a sense, his previous life caught up with him and ensured that he died at a very young age. Jack Lynch at that stage was Taoiseach. Jack Lynch made the point when Donogh O'Malley had died that he not only saw horizons that few of the rest of us dared to contemplate, but he actually reached out beyond those horizons in order to try and bestow good on his fellow citizens. Now, if I have one question tonight, or one fundamental question, it is why so few dared to contemplate those horizons after the demise of Donogh O'Malley in 1968. We do get some indication in the cabinet files and in the government papers that are in existence for the late 1960s. If you look at the response, for example, to Donogh O'Malley's initial proposals with regard to education, it seems quite ironic that Jack Lynch ended up heaping so much praise on him. Because Jack Lynch was bloody furious when he was Minister for Finance that this young upstart had announced this dramatic venture in the Irish education system without getting prior approval from the Department of Finance, which is often the only way you can actually change things in Irish politics. You don't go to the Department of Finance first because you'll invariably be told no. But of course, this is exactly what Donogh O'Malley did. And Donogh O'Malley wrote a very interesting letter to Sean Lemass, who had mildly rebuked him. They seemed to have a kind of an interesting father-son type dynamic going on, where he clearly admired him, but was also annoyed with him for upsetting his Minister for Finance. And Donogh O'Malley refused to back down. He said that he believed it was essential from time to time to propound bold new policies that both capture the public imagination and respond to some widely held, if not clearly formulated, demand on the part of that population. What he was saying, in effect, was that it was the job of politicians to lead rather than to react. And this was a view of Irish politics that sadly seems to go out of fashion relatively quickly. It's a view of politics that led to a title for a biography of Donogh O'Malley, Unfulfilled Promise, which I have shamelessly stolen tonight. It raised the question, this biography of Donogh O'Malley by P.J. Brown, as to whether or not Donogh O'Malley could have gone on to become Taoiseach had he lived. Was he the kind of politician who could have changed Ireland even more than he did? I doubt it. One of the other themes that's running through this particular presentation tonight is how important style is in politics, how important temperament is in politics. Perhaps Donogh O'Malley didn't have the kind of temperament to be an effective leader. We'll actually never know, but going on his previous record, perhaps he didn't. It also raises the question of the kind of contemporaries that Donogh O'Malley had. People like George Colley, who I mentioned earlier on. People like Charles Haughey, who I mentioned earlier on. Colley was again quieter. Haughey, on the other hand, was loud. He was aggressive. He was nakedly ambitious. And there is that particular temperament that seemed to thrive in Fianna Fáil at that time, particularly as you move into the 1970s. So in a sense, perhaps Donogh O'Malley would not have become Irish Taoiseach or Irish Prime Minister. But I think it's more interesting to reflect on the kind of political ideas he articulated, and in particular that fundamental message that he sent to Sean Lemass when he was still Taoiseach about what the role of politicians was, or at least should be. Because what you often get instead of that leadership is this fear in political parties. And that fear about change, about embracing new ideas, about embracing what were perceived as radical ideas, did often stifle political debate and political progress and social progress in Ireland as well. Many of you will be aware that Fianna Fáil was engulfed in internal infighting and fairly savage feuding in the early 1970s as a result of the arms trial and a result of the outbreak of the Troubles in Northern Ireland. But I would like to make the point tonight that there were other debates going on with Fianna Fáil that didn't really have anything to do with the extent to which the Troubles was going to impinge on the Republic. If you look at the state papers released in 1990s relating to the government of the 1960s, the Fianna Fáil governments of the 1960s, you can see a young Kevin Boland, for example, a minister, a son of one of the founders of the party, who is arguing with the Department of Finance about the extent to which Fianna Fáil is paying attention to what he terms the weaker sections of the Irish community. Quite clearly in the 1960s there was a degree of optimism there. There was a degree of economic expansion that was unprecedented in Ireland until that time. And he was making the point that there was a feeling that they simply had not done enough to spread that particular wealth around. He was told by the Department of Finance that he was seeking to wreck the second programme for economic expansion. And this is where we see Fianna Fáil in their very comfortable capitalist zone in the 1960s. They are cultivating links with those who are the public face of the boom in Ireland, in particular the builders, those who want to see Dublin and other cities dominated by cranes. But they were not necessarily going to be disturbed in that comfortable capitalist zone by Fine Gael, or by Fine Gael's proposals for a just society, which were adopted quite late and quite half-heartedly, as I mentioned earlier on. We associate the idea of the just society with Declan Costello in particular, but also a young Garret Fitzgerald. They were not necessarily seeking to reject liberalism and socialism, but seeking perhaps to wed them into some kind of fabric or some kind of philosophy of Irish identity or some kind of new philosophy of Irish politics. The idea of integrating those liberal ideas was something that was definitely intellectually exciting for them in the middle of the 1960s. Now, what it meant in practice, of course, had to do with how income was distributed, the extent to which the state should intervene when it comes to the distribution of wealth. Issues like income tax, like capital gain tax, like the idea in particular of greater state intervention when it came to welfare. They were not particularly radical ideas when you look back on them now from the vantage of the early 21st century. But they did scare an older generation within the Fine Gael party. They scared Gerald Sweetman in particular, who was the Fine Gael spokesperson for finance, who had formerly been a minister for finance as well. And they scared James Dillon, who regarded them as very alarming. Declan Costello was often seen as a dangerous socialist by that older wing of Fine Gael. Maurice Manning, the political scientist, made the point earlier this year that worst of all, Declan Costello was seen as an academic in politics, which perhaps is the most dangerous thing of all to be in politics. But it raised this issue of whether or not Fine Gael was going to be able to carve out a separate and distinct identity from Fianna Fáil. And this was one of those themes of the 1960s that led to all sorts, I think, of lost opportunities as well. What would have happened, for example, if the Fine Gael Just Society proposals had been taken to their logical conclusion? Could it have led to a merger between the Irish Labour Party and Fine Gael Party as the main opposition party? What would that have meant in practice? Could we have had a significantly big left-of-centre social democratic party at that time in the 1960s? We could have. There were ideas, there were proposals for merging the two parties. They never got off the ground for all sorts of different reasons. The fact that they never got off the ground meant that Fine Gael spent the next 30 years struggling to articulate why they were different from Fianna Fáil. Some of the political scientists have done very interesting work on this, particularly in a book called Days of Blue Loyalty by Michael Marsh and Michael Gallagher, the political scientists who make the point that when Fine Gael members down through the years were asked what was the main difference between themselves and Fianna Fáil, they used to say, "We are more honourable than Fianna Fáil." There was no mention of social and economic differences. There was no mention of ideology. There was no mention of philosophy. The simple assertion that they were more honourable than Fianna Fáil. It also, I suppose, shines a light on the Labour Party and its aspirations at this time as well. And the debate on change, on equality, on the role of the state was very relevant to the Labour Party, particularly by the end of the 1960s. God bless their innocence, they even declared that the 70s would be socialist in Ireland. And this was their slogan, of course, going into the 1969 general election. They fielded 99 candidates, unprecedented for the Labour Party. They officially came out of the closet as socialists. Now, Charles Haughey at that stage was in charge of Fianna Fáil's election campaign in 1969. And he made the point that the Irish public were not going to trust the Labour Party's manifestos because manifestos had a Marxist ring to them. And Fianna Fáil went on to indulge in this red scare, this scare about communism throughout this general election campaign in 1969. There's a great irony, of course, in this, because the Red Scare had been used against Fianna Fáil in the 1930s when they were perceived to be too socially radical for the main political establishment, Cumann and Gael, or what became Fine Gael at that time. But here, of course, this Red Scare is being used shamelessly by Fianna Fáil during this particular election campaign. Just to give you a few examples of what it involved, Michael Moran, a Fianna Fáil TD or Member of Parliament, referred to Brendan Corish, who at the time was leader of the Labour Party, as a mere puppet of the modern Marxist elite and the political queers of Trinity College Dublin. It was quite clear that these ideas were foreign and alien ideas and had no place in Irish democratic society. It was also loudly asserted that the Labour Party was going to confiscate Guinness Brewery in the interests of socialism, of course, not of sobriety, once they got into government, as part of a wider programme of nationalisation. The Mayo TD, Joseph Lenihan, Mayo TD, or Member of Parliament for Mayo, made the point that if Labour got into power, what would follow would be divorce, abortion, and in his own words, it would be great for the fellow who wanted a second wife every night. So they were not just scaremongering about the Labour Party's social policy or economic policies, they were also scared, of course, about socially what would happen as well. Now, it didn't happen for the Labour Party in 1969. They got 17 seats, which is actually 4 less than they had got in the previous general election. And they had to wait until 1973 before they were once again in government, this time with Fine Gael as part of that coalition that lasted until 1977. Now, that's a coalition that was often preoccupied with the sectarian warfare that was going on in Northern Ireland. They didn't want it to spill over the border into the Republic, and that was a very obvious political preoccupation and priority for Fine Gael and Labour at that time. But they did make sure that when times got tough economically, those poorer sections of Irish society did not have to bear the brunt. Social welfare payments, for example, were actually increased overall by 125% while that particular government was in power. They introduced an unmarried mother's allowance for the first time in 1973, which in ideological terms was like stepping onto a new planet for Ireland. The political return, however, for all this was absolutely zero. That coalition government was decimated in the 1977 general election. Richie Ryan, who was Minister for Finance in that coalition, earned the particular title Richie Ruin as a result of some of the more severe decisions that he had to make. He often had fights with Frank Cluskey, who was the Labour Party's Minister for Social Welfare in that government. And they met each other briefly after they had been decimated in the 1977 general election. And Frank Cluskey turned around to Richie Ryan and said, "You were right about all the welfare increases. You always said we would get no fucking thanks." And there they were looking at the debris of that coalition government, looking at a populist Fianna Fáil manifesto that swept them to power in 1977. But we now know also, as a result of the state paper releases from recent years, particularly 2005, some of the debates that were going on between Fine Gael and Labour within that government, particularly around the subject of a wealth tax. This was something, ironically, that had initially been considered by Fianna Fáil in 1970, but they dropped it. Fine Gael and Richie Ryan, or Richie Roon, to give him his unfortunate title, did resurrect this idea in 1974. And the reaction was extraordinary from bishops and businessmen and farmers who urged them not to even think about embracing the doctrinaire socialism of the Irish Labour Party. The Bishop of Kilmore, for example, Ed Moore, wrote to Liam Cosgrave, who was Taoiseach or Prime Minister at the time, to emphasise that this proposal had badly shaken confidence in the government. The Irish Farmers Association wrote on behalf of itself, as did John Bruton, who emphasised how dependent he was on the farming vote. What I found most interesting, though, was the reaction of Richie Ryan as Minister for Finance, who derided what he called the highly emotional reaction to a wealth tax that was only going to affect the very rich in Irish society. He made the point that all other progressive democracies had some form of a wealth tax, and that one was totally justifiable in Ireland. It was eventually introduced in 1975. It was levied on 1% of assets over £100,000. That's a hell of a lot of assets in Ireland in 1975. But homes were exempted. Livestock were exempted. So there were, of course, all these key constituencies that were going to be exempt from that anyway. Fianna Fáil, of course, abolished it and scrapped it in 1977. They had committed themselves to doing that during the general election campaign of 1977. And so, in a sense, began that period of politics that seemed to prove that the cult of the ideologically indifferent or neutral leader could ensure political longevity. And in that sense, it's worth reflecting for a few moments on the impact that Charles Haughey made, on the impact that Garret Fitzgerald made. These were the two icons of Irish politics in the 1980s. It's interesting to reflect on the differences between the two men as well. To what extent, for example, was Garret Fitzgerald going to try and continue the concept of the just society now that he was actually within shouting power, within shouting distance of power? Was he going to try and implement some of those ideas that had been delayed because of resistance from the older, more conservative elements of Fine Gael in the 1960s? Well, in a sense, Garret Fitzgerald played it quite clever. He was somebody who did talk about change and the need to be enthusiastic about change, but that you had to do it by being rooted in tradition. And this was Garret Fitzgerald, I suppose, as a politician who had a liberal head on a conservative body. And that's a description that's been used by William Murphy, who wrote about him in the most recent issue of Era Ireland. Garret Fitzgerald, when he introduced his book in 2004, Reflections on Irish Politics, suggested that there were four motivating factors when it came to people getting involved in politics. There was emotion, there was ideology, there were ideas, and there were interests. And Garret Fitzgerald rejected the first two. He believed that politics was about trying to reconcile ideas with interests. He rejected the idea of emotion and ideology being involved. Now, when you look at that, what he's really saying is that he is a centrist politician. Nothing unusual, perhaps, about being a centrist politician in Ireland. What was unusual about Garret Fitzgerald was that at least that centrist position was based on some kind of philosophic reasoning, that this was somebody who had actually thought about where he stood on the political spectrum. Now, you can always rely on Garret Fitzgerald to make things very complicated, because when he was asked in Portugal in 1974 where he stood on the political spectrum, he suggested he was on the social democratic end of the Christian democratic spectrum. You can figure that out for yourself. I'm not quite sure what he meant by that. But it was, again, the thinking about politics, the thinking Garret Fitzgerald when it came to articulating where exactly he stood. And he was unusual in that willingness, I think, to try and articulate a certain vision as well. Very unlike Charles Haughey, who was opportunistic. If you look at some of the correspondence between Charles Haughey and Sean Lemass when Sean Lemass was still Taoiseach, it's quite clear that Haughey had a lot of respect and affection for Sean Lemass. But he also wanted to persuade Sean Lemass to be more aggressive in depicting Fine Gael as a right-wing party. And Sean Lemass slapped him down. Sean Lemass didn't want to be involved in this idea of labelling the Fine Gael as a right-wing conservative party. Sean Lemass was much more interested throughout his career in insisting that Fianna Fáil was the real Irish Labour Party, and that there wasn't a need for a Labour Party in Irish politics because it already existed in the form of Fianna Fáil. But that particular letter sparked some questioning in my mind about whether Haughey himself had actually thought about where he stood on the political spectrum. He had in 1969, as I've already illustrated, insisted that socialism was an alien gospel, that this was not something that Irish people would be ever remotely comfortable with. He also used a number of other phrases throughout his political career, including the one he constantly reiterated, that Fianna Fáil had great and aspiring social objectives. If you look at his collected speeches, they're entitled Spirit of the Nation, which seems to me to be a very overly generous title when it comes to the kind of contribution that Haughey made to political debate in Ireland. Great and aspiring social objectives, he may have had them in the 1960s. Charles Haughey, in all sorts of respects, was a very effective minister for justice, for example, in the 1960s when it came to actually making fundamental change. But there was no delivery on that promise of change after he became leader of Fianna Fáil in 1979. And this is where we get the cult of the leader becoming more important than the policies, becoming more important than articulating an authentic vision or articulating authentic values. What we get instead is this sense of himself becoming much more powerful than any sense of what he has for Irish society or any sense of the ideas that he has for Irish society. He was labelled by Peter Murtagh, a journalist who covered all the heaves and the internal feuding in Fianna Fáil in the 1980s, a dangerous, self-obsessed, narcissistic bully. Now, Peter Murtagh made the point that historians would be much kinder to Charles Haughey than contemporary journalists, partly because contemporary journalists were also intimidated by Haughey and his supporters throughout the 1980s. But I wonder, will history be much kinder to Charles Haughey than that damning verdict from Peter Murtagh, the journalist there? One looks in vain for consistency in the career of Charles Haughey. It's often remarked that he discovered fiscal rectitude, for example, in 1987. It's true that he made a contribution to Anglo-Irish relations, particularly in terms of establishing the idea of two sovereign governments working on a par with each other to try and deal with the problem of Northern Ireland. But he had also demonstrated huge cynicism in his opposition to the Anglo-Irish Agreement of 1985. He did introduce very important social measures that he's remembered for, and quite rightly, like, for example, free travel, like exemption from taxation for artists. I have to, of course, mention that to declare an interest. But he's also somebody who did not seem to be able to articulate a core philosophical or political idea. And that sense of himself and that sense of obsession about gaining an overall majority, about gaining control of the Fianna Fáil party, was something that did an awful lot of damage to Irish politics throughout the 1980s. There's also a sense that when you look at the damning verdict of the tribunal that was investigating his personal finances, the Moriarty Tribunal, you get an idea of the stark differences in values between the Civil War generation of Irish politicians and those that followed them. That final report into payments to Haughey by Judge Moriarty suggested that in accepting millions, he had devalued the quality of a national democracy. And the reason I'm making that point is because in the absence of more detailed documentation, those tribunal reports are going to be very important for historians in terms of trying to make sense of what was going on in Irish politics and the links between Irish politics and land developers and the links between Irish politicians and Irish businessmen throughout the 1970s, 1980s and indeed 1990s. And what about Bertie Ahern? Bertie Ahern was another of these long-serving Irish prime ministers, only stepped down earlier this year. Is there such a thing as Ahernism? Will historians of the future talk about Ahernism? Well, he's been quite rightly given a lot of credit for the huge contribution he made to a settlement of the problem in Northern Ireland, for the contribution he made to political stability in Ireland in the late 20th and the early 21st century, for the key role that he played in social partnership throughout this era as well. The idea of the government and the various sections of the Irish economy coming together in order to hammer out social agreements was very, very important factor in contributing to the stability of Irish politics and indeed the Irish economy. But did he have any ideology? Was there any philosophical position there? Was there any vision there? Well, in 2004, he declared himself one of the few remaining socialists in Irish politics. Now, when the laughter had died down after this declaration of socialism in 2004, Bertie Ahern made the point in a television interview that Fianna Fáil looked after the big guy, the small guy, and the guy in between. And this, for him, of course, was a definition of Irish socialism. In a sense, he was trying to reiterate what Brian Lenihan Sr. Had famously said about Fianna Fáil in a previous era, that Fianna Fáil was a party of the left, the right, and the centre. So you really can't go wrong when it comes to giving your allegiance to Fianna Fáil. Now, what this meant, of course, in practice, particularly in the era of coalition governments, was that Fianna Fáil was able to share power with anyone. They went from a party that had all of the power most of the time to a party that had most of the power all of the time. And that is one of the reasons why Bertie Ahern thrived as Prime Minister, because of his reputation as a consensus politician, because of his reputation as somebody who could not be labelled in a particular way, because he was somebody who could work with anyone. And the only reason for this declaration of socialism in 2004 was because Fianna Fáil was getting a lot of criticism about a lurch to the right under Charlie McCreevy, who was perceived to be quite a right-wing Minister for Finance at that time. And Bertie Ahern, in true Ahern style, made sure that he was carted off to Europe as Ireland's new EU Commissioner. Now, when you look at Bertie Ahern, you also have to acknowledge his cleverness as a political strategist, because whatever about his own lack of vision or his own lack of articulation of values or vision in Irish politics, he learnt an awful lot from previous leaders of Fianna Fáil. And even in his approach to his own party's history, Bertie Ahern was a consensus man. He learnt from Charles Haughey. He learnt from Haughey's cunning and his reliance on friends. He learnt from Jack Lynch's populism and his connection with voters. He learnt from Sean Lemass's championing of private enterprise, whilst at the same time declaring Fianna Fáil to be the real Labour Party. And he even borrowed a bit from Eamon de Valera in terms of this ability in 2004 to articulate this concept of frugality, that he was not somebody who was interested in the trappings, not somebody who was interested in wealth. Once again, the tribunal verdicts are going to be very important to establish the veracity or lack of veracity of that particular assertion. But it also highlights the degree to which personality has been central to these more recent political campaigns. In many respects, the election campaigns became handshaking marathons. But that sense of the personality of Bertie Ahern became crucially important in his political longevity, and it ensured a continual electoral success, 3 general elections in a row, which of course made him the most successful leader of Fianna Fáil after Eamon de Valera. I mentioned earlier that political change was often going to come from outside of the political parties, from the courts, from particular courageous individuals who were determined to try and vindicate their personal rights through the courts, through organizations, voluntary organizations that were working on the ground, that were prioritizing issues like consumerism, like housing, like health, like education. In this sense, we need to know an awful lot more about the history of the Irish Supreme Court. That same Supreme Court in 1940 made the point that it was not for it to determine the rights of citizens. That was a matter that lay within the province of the Irish Parliament. Now, this becomes even more significant when you look at what happens in the 1950s, when the Irish Supreme Court does begin to make judgments and decisions about interpreting particular articles in the Irish Constitution when it comes to the rights of individuals. We do know that Sean Lemass, as Prime Minister, when he took over from Eamon de Valera in 1959, was keen to get the Supreme Court to model itself on the American Supreme Court, to look at the decisions from the American Supreme Court, to look at the whole question of precedent when it came to vindicating the rights of individuals. What we don't know perhaps enough of is how much political tension this actually caused. Is it the case that the role of the Irish Parliament was ultimately usurped by the Supreme Court, by these judicial systems, by the judicial process? That is something that we need much more investigation into. David Gwynne Morgan, who is a leading scholar of the Irish Constitution, made the point that the fact that the Supreme Court was leading the way with regard to social change and political change in Ireland meant that there was a very inappropriate relationship between Irish politics and the Irish Supreme Court. That in a sense it weakened and decayed democracy, because these fundamental decisions were not being made by the people who were elected to make those decisions. They were effectively being made by the courts. Now, there are a number of cases that I could cite in relation to the vindication of personal rights. One of the most obvious, of course, is the case that was taken with regard to the constitutional ban on the sale and importation of contraceptives, the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1935, which was challenged successfully by Mary McGee, a married woman who was importing contraceptives that were stopped by customs. This is a campaign, of course, that Mary Robinson was involved in, and she appears again and again in these government papers as somebody who is continually asking them to legislate and not wait for the Supreme Court to force these decisions to be made. There are other cases later on, particularly with regard to David Norris and the attempts to get homosexuality decriminalised in Ireland, which doesn't actually happen until the early 1990s, even though a decision in his favour from the European Court came in 1988. But these were individuals who had to do that because politicians were refusing to legislate for these particular issues. And even after these decisions have been made by the Supreme Court, finding a political solution to these problems was not always easy or was not always embraced. You can see this particularly in relation to contraception because of the state papers that were released in 2005 in relation to the Fine Gael Labour coalition that had to legislate for this Supreme Court decision in the McGee case in 1973. And you can see extraordinary rows between the Minister for Justice at the time, Patrick Cooney, and the Attorney General, one Declan Costello, he of Just Society fame. Declan Costello, it seemed, had lurched very much to the right when it came to the rights of individuals at this stage. He was talking about the power of suspicion. He was talking, as Attorney General, about wanting to see guards having the right to demand of those who they suspected were in unlawful possession of contraceptives that they were able to name the time and the date of their marriage and produce a marriage certificate in order to ensure that they could use contraceptives. Now, this, of course, was quite extraordinary. And Patrick Cooney, even though he was not seen as a great bastion of liberalism, was appalled by the idea that the Attorney General would encourage the idea of the onus of proof now lying with the individual as opposed to lying with the state. This, he said, clearly contravened the European Charter of Human Rights. And these were debates that were going on and rows that were going on within that political party. It's quite, within that particular government. It's quite clear, of course, that there were even worse contributions made by Irish men when it came to Irish women and contraception in the 1980s. There's a whole litany of patronising male contributions that you can trace throughout the Dáil record, the Parliament record, and the Senate record as well. Senator Michael O'Toole, for example, in the early 1980s, when the political parties were grappling with the idea of a greater liberalisation of the contraceptive laws, insisted that in the part of the country where he came from, they practiced their own methods of family planning. And he said they had worked reasonably successful up to now. I have 8 children. I know something about this subject. And there were those, of course, who were also trying to get legislation introduced with regard to issues like rape. Gemma Hussey, for example, a young Fine Gael senator in the early 1980s, talking about some of the contributions in Parliament that she had to listen to, such as one individual who insisted that women upset the biological balance of men and then cried rape. And this, of course, was being put forward as an argument not to introduce more sympathetic legislation for the victims of rape at that stage. So you can trace an awful lot of these particular contributions throughout the 1980s. You also get a degree of cynicism as a result of the cumulative effect of these contributions. The 1980s was not a good decade for Irish women. When you consider the whole succession of public ordeals that certain women had to undergo as a result of these so-called moral civil wars in Irish society. Infanticide, divorce, abortion, all these debates, poisonous, often poisonous debates. But they also highlighted to a certain extent the degree to which there were divisions within the women's movement. And this, of course, is central to this problem of the contribution of women to Irish politics, which has to be mentioned in the context of this quest for a more just society. If you look at the cynicism that was engendered as a result of the 1980s, the question was often asked in relation to that cynicism, why do more women not get involved in politics? Well, part of it had to do with the class divisions within the women's movement. Reading, for example, Nell McCafferty's wonderful autobiography, Nell, she talks about the differences that were clear in the early 1970s between herself and Mary Kenny. Nell McCafferty from the Bogside of Derry. According to herself, she smelt of whiskey and petrol fumes. Mary Kenny, on the other hand, working as a dynamic journalist with the Irish Press, she smelt of perfume and champagne. And she was trying to highlight the degree of class divisions that existed within the women's movement at that stage, that they couldn't necessarily agree on one particular approach to getting more women involved in Irish politics. There was also a contribution made by Catherine McAngasa in 1968 when she talked about women having to take responsibility for them not being involved in politics. She talked about the shoulder-shrugging cynicism of women when it came to politics, that they were prepared to rely on women who were the relatives of dead Irish, of dead male politicians to carry on the tradition of women in Irish politics. That the women who were in the Dáil, the small number of women who were in the Dáil in the 1960s and the 1970s, were only there because they were related to dead male politicians. There was a degree of truth in that. But there was also this question of whether or not they could establish an organisation that would be effective in bringing more women into politics. And Garret FitzGerald was keen to do this with regard to Fine Gael as well. Well, there was a women's political association established, but they found it extraordinarily difficult to challenge what had been a male political culture for so long. There were 5 female members of Parliament in Ireland out of 148 in 1979. There were 11 in 1981. There were 14 in 1982. There were 20 in 1992. There were 20 in 1997. And if you trace this right up to the most recent general election 18 months ago, you can see that the largest political party, Fianna Fáil, fielded 105 candidates. 14 of those candidates were women. Now, of course, that raises the question of why they weren't more successful. Clearly, there was a certain impetus there in the 1990s. Many people were optimistic after the election of Mary Robinson as President of Ireland in 1990 that more women would get involved, that this might actually open a gate for women to get involved. But isn't it quite ironic that it was Mary Robinson who, in a sense, transformed the office of Irish President, but was transforming the office that had the least power? There is now this talk about the Irish presidency having become feminized, that the reason women thrive as presidents is because they don't really have any political power. And that is something that feminist historians are going to be having interesting reflections on, I think, well into the future. But we should acknowledge the success that women did achieve outside of the political process and outside of the political parties in particular. The success of the Council for the Status of Women, for example. Mary Cummins, the late journalist who worked for the Irish Times and wrote a women's page in the Irish Times, got very weary in the early 90s about foreign journalists coming over to Ireland because all they wanted to hear about were the trials of Irish women. The Kerry Babies case, the X case, when a 14-year-old rape victim was prevented from leaving the country for an abortion. They wanted to hear about the abortion referendums, the divorce referendums. And Mary Cummins turned on them, and she said, particularly to American journalists, how many weeks maternity leave do you get in the United States? How many weeks maternity leave do Irish women get? At that stage, it was 18 weeks. Compare that to the situation in the United States. She said, not all Irish women spend the weekends killing their babies and burying them in their back gardens. And she sent them on their way with this lecture about what Irish women had achieved. They hadn't necessarily achieved it through the political parties, but they had effected change for the better. And I think it's important to keep that particular point in mind. The final point I want to make has to do with the so-called sophistication of the Irish electorate in the midst of all this. You'll often hear that assertion being made that the Irish electorate are the most sophisticated in the world. I'm quite cynical about that assertion. It's often something that's associated with 1959 when Eamon de Valera tried to not only get himself elected president, but also to abolish proportional representation in Ireland. And the Irish electorate said yes to Dev as president and get your bloody hands off our proportional representation system. And they rejected it again at a later stage as well. Perhaps that did demonstrate a degree of political sophistication. But contrast the assertion of sophistication with this assertion from Garret FitzGerald, that the Irish electorate have consistently shown extreme passivity in the face of maladministration by weak politicians. And that is an assertion that, for me, holds more veracity than the previous one. And perhaps, in light of what's happening in Ireland at the moment, we may even have to reconsider Garret FitzGerald's assertion, given that so-called grey power is now something that has come to Ireland in the terms of pensioners battling on the streets, battling against the government on the streets, not against each other. This idea of extreme passivity is, of course, something that's going to be very strongly challenged in the next couple of years as a result of the end of the economic boom. But to go back to the point of sophistication, what kind of a sophisticated electorate only responds to one central argument in general elections from 1997 onwards? The idea that everything could be reduced to the issue of personal taxation. Dick Walsh, who was a political correspondent with the Irish Times in the 1990s, made the point that making Ireland a fairer place simply did not figure as an issue of political debate in Ireland throughout these general elections, 1992, 1997, 2002 again. These were issues, he said, that were best left to the Labour Party, the trade unions, or the bishops. And of course there was a degree of truth in that. Bishop Brendan Comiskey, for example, the Bishop of Ferns, had declared as early as the 1970s that the authentic man of Christ in the modern era is one who carries a Bible in one hand and a copy of the latest Economic, Social and Research Institute report in the other. That it was up to them to chide the government for not doing enough for the weaker sections of Irish society. And what we got instead are campaigns that were based on handshaking, as I mentioned earlier on personality, on this idea of a very vigorous campaign throughout the country without actually saying very much at all. We also had the continuing problem of how the Irish political system, and particularly Irish elections, were funded. What's the difference between a personal donation and a political donation when it comes to the operation of Irish politics? We still don't seem to know the answer to that particular question. Brian Trench, when he worked for McGill magazine that I mentioned earlier on in 1981, made the point that election finances were shrouded in mystery. And that was an assertion that was particularly relevant to a time when there were three general elections between 1981 and 1982. It's quite clear that when it came to accountability, that we simply did not have enough information about how these war chests were being contributed to and who was contributing to them as well. And there are those links, of course, those crucial links between politics and business that further undermines this quest for a just society, because they made it so much easier for unjust things to be done. And this is not just about the politicians. This is about those who elected them. This is about the vested interests that ensured that they had so much money, politicians, when it came to contributions and so on. And it's also about them being facilitated when it comes to the second social revolution in Ireland, which was associated with this economic boom, or an economic revolution perhaps would be more accurate. It seems to me very ironic that the 19th century social revolution, in which the political and economic power of the landlords was challenged, was broken, was to be replaced 100 years later by a new species of landlord, a native species of landlord who exercised their domination of land in an even more invidious way than some of their most wretched 19th century predecessors. What does that say about the quest for a just society and Irish politics throughout this period? Again, we may have to wait for the various tribunal verdicts to actually establish an answer to that particular question. Now, perhaps I've been too gloomy, and I would like to say, in summing up, that things could have been a lot worse. One of the things that many people from outside of Ireland noticed over the last 10 or 12 years is the degree of political stability in Ireland, and this has been hugely important. The late, great Mary Holland, another one of these pioneering female journalists from the 1980s and the 1990s, made the very important assertion in 2002, while there was another general election campaign going on, that she herself had written countless columns decrying the deadening effect of civil war politics. The idea that political debate for so long in Ireland had been rooted in whose grandfather had shot whose grandfather, that this had led to this deadening consensus as she had described it. But she was reassessing her position by 2002. She made the point that in many respects, civil war politics had served Ireland well. Because at a time in Great Britain, for example, when there was this declaration by Margaret Thatcher that there was no such thing as society, Irish politicians were working with their social partners in order to bring a degree of industrial stability, and it worked. It's something that couldn't have happened in Britain in the 1980s because of the ideological gulfs, because Margaret Thatcher was somebody who was articulating her gut feeling or her vision. Many people in Ireland found it obnoxious, was something that Mary Holland pointed out. And if you had had those divisions in Irish politics, you probably wouldn't have had that successful partnership and that degree of stability. Nonetheless, it's probably fair to say that ideology remained a filthy word. And you do get a different kind of deadening effect, which has to do with a refusal to engage and a refusal to debate. The Jesuit Edmund Grace, for example, wrote a book a couple of years ago called Democracy and Happiness. And he talked about the great fatigue that existed with public life in Ireland. The idea of it being about an exchange of scripts between well-rehearsed performers, all of them playing to the middle ground. And that was a very accurate description of Irish politics and the lack of political debate at that stage. And you can still see the fear that I mentioned earlier on about being labelled. If Irish politicians do articulate what they stand for, they often will qualify it. John Bruton, for example, another leader of Fine Gael when he was departing the political stage in Ireland, made the point that he was a conviction politician, not an ideological politician. This prompted Michael D. Higgins, one of the prominent intellectuals in the Labour Party, to make the assertion that to be an intellectual in Irish politics, even of the right, is a greater disability than being sexually perverse. You could always count on Michael D. Higgins to very colourfully describe the shortcomings of his colleagues, of his political contemporaries. But you can see the point that he was making. There was always this sense that they had to qualify any assertions that they made, lest they be seen as too radical, lest they be seen as too independent. Again, that obsession perhaps with consensus and that deadening push towards the middle ground. In all of this, there does seem to be a lack of fundamental debate about doing things very, very differently. And if you look at some of the issues that I mentioned as being significant in the 1960s in terms of the direction of Irish society, it does seem by the end of the 20th century that the resources were there to try and tackle more effectively those particular problems. There were vast resources there. They weren't deployed, it seems, very effectively, particularly when it came to the issue of public services. So many of those questions asked and many of those problems raised in the 1960s have not been answered and have not been addressed properly, and perhaps won't be now as a result of the end of the boom. Thank you.